videos of other people knitting and crocheting, very beginner tutorials that from YouTube. If you have questions, just reach out and we'll answer them. But first I want to just tell you a little bit about knitting and crocheting, right? So typically when we're knitting and crocheting, right, we know we're using yarn. Yarn comes in a lot of different materials, so you can get less expensive acrylic yarn at places like Joann's and Walmart. It comes in materials like traditional materials like wool. You can also get linen, you can get silk. There's a ton of different fibers that can be used to make a yarn, okay? So when you buy yarn, you want to look, the label that comes on it actually has a lot of really great information, and you probably want to hang on to this label even after you don't need it, okay? So when you look at the label, one of the things that it will tell you is your fiber content. This one is 80% acrylic, 20% wool. It will also tell you if you knit it 9 stitches by 12 rows, it should be 4 inches by 4 inches. That's how big your sample piece should be. If you're crocheting it with a number 10 hook, and you do 7 stitches by 8 rows, that should be a 4 by 4 square. Okay, so when you do, sometimes you want to do like a sample square before you start really getting into your project. Okay, this is a sample square for a project. This is a sample for a project. And this is going to tell you about your gauge. Okay, and that's the word we use for that, your gauge. It's not going to be as important for you with your little samples that you're making for us. But if you decide you really like this and you want to knit a vest or a sweater, you want to figure out how big your stitches are. Everybody has a different tension in your hands, just like the tension in the sewing machine. You have different tension in your hands, the size of the yarn, the size of the needle, all come together to make a gauge. And you always want to do a sample, because otherwise you could wind up with a very, very tiny little sweater or a ginormously huge sweater. And so if you do that gauge square, it'll help you figure out if your garment's going to come out the right size. So that's just telling you a little bit about, that's what that information is that's here. There's also frequently what's called a die lot on your yarn, and it's a number, like a 6-digit number a lot of times. That's a die lot. You want to, if you're making a project and you're going to buy 4 or 5 skeins of yarn, you want to make sure the die lot is the same on all of them, because it's very sad to knit the whole thing and then realize the last skein was a little bit lighter color or a little bit bluer or whatever than the first one. So if you check the die lot and they all match, then the yarn should match the whole way through your project. Some things, like acrylics, often will say no die lot, and that's because the fibers are created with a certain color composition and it doesn't change in what they produce. Okay, so that's yarn. This is kind of a traditional yarn that we would think of for knitting and crocheting. This one is what's called a super bulky. This one makes, a lot thicker, bulkier, product. And then you have what are kind of decorative yarns. Be really careful of these if you are a beginner knitter or crocheter. These are a little bit more challenging to work with, simply because it's easy to get your needles stuck inside of it. So if you're a beginner, stay with the simpler yarns that we've given you. All right, let's talk a little bit about needles. Okay, needles come in different sizes as well. So these are a size 2, which is very small, right? All the way up to these ginormous needles that are like for like knitting super bulky blankets, like arm knitting. If you've seen anybody do arm knitting, there are 2 different sizing methods. You can see these are 25 millimeter. You'll see ones that are millimeter sized, and then you'll see ones that just have a number like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and that's like a US sizing convention. So a lot of times they may have 2 sizes on them, 2 numbers on them. It's just telling you 2 different sizes and 2 different systems. These are what are called double pointed needles because they have double points on each end. You can use these for things like if you're knitting socks. You can knit tubes with these. Okay, and you'll use them like this or like this, or we're not doing this. But just in case this is something you're interested in, because you started here and you love knitting so much that you couldn't get enough of it. Okay, remember we talked about gauge. Your projects are probably not going to all turn out the same size. So these are other students' knit samples from the past. 24 rows, 24 stitches. 24 rows, 24 stitches. Okay, they're not. You can see this one is much more open because it was a much larger, not this large, but a much larger needle used, whereas this one used a much smaller needle. Okay, so your final product is going to be a combination of the size of needle that you use and the size of yarn that you use. So don't panic if yours is looking different than somebody else's. It's because you have different tools. Okay. So watch the video. Oh, sorry, and I threw the crochet hook on the floor. This is a crochet hook. Those of you who are learning to crochet, you can see it has a hook where the needles, the knitting needles don't have that hook, and you use one, not two. And so in this case, when you're crocheting, you are making a series of, I'm going to cast on here. You're going to make a series of loops that you then pull back through the original loop. Okay, and it's just about how many loops you make and how many loops you pull through. It's really a really simple and kind of repetitive thing, but maybe you guys will find this to be a relaxing hobby to try. So enjoy your knitting and crocheting, and let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.